I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
You guys don't need to worry about me getting revenge from Diddy. I've got 3 moves that make sure he'll never be able to come after me or my family. First, I personally reached out to the victims' legal teams. The real reason he's not getting out is those buried cases behind the scenes. I provided legal funding for 7 victims who had been silent for years and brought in the top criminal attorneys in the country. Second, I bought up every potential post-release business deal he had lined up. I planned this 2 years in advance, so by the time he got sentenced and still had hope of getting out, every partner had already cut ties with him. Third, I don't just have evidence, I've got backups. This is an entire minefield that's been buried for 20 years. I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. With testimonies from the victims, we interviewed over a dozen people he tricked, threatened, or violated. You think that's harsh? No, he destroyed other people's lives for decades. I'm just making sure he spends a few extra years in prison for it. I'm not afraid of his people, not afraid of his threats. I know he's still in there fantasizing about a comeback, but the truth is, he's never coming back.
Secret parties, closed-door gatherings, late-night events hidden from cameras, private relationships no one ever acknowledged. And this time, it's not rumors, it's 50 Cent. On December 2nd, 2025, 50 Cent released a 4-part Netflix documentary that quietly shook the industry. Now 50 Cent is back with a new documentary, and this time, the names Diddy and Jay-Z keep appearing in the same private spaces. Not on red carpets, not in interviews, behind closed doors. In this new Netflix documentary, 50 Cent doesn't shout accusations about Diddy or Jay-Z. He reveals patterns of secrecy, patterns of silence, patterns that existed for years without explanation. And once you see how long Diddy, Jay-Z, and powerful names moved in a world without cameras, you'll understand why this documentary is making people uncomfortable right now. Smona, what the documentary reveals first isn't chaos, it's control. Before the parties, before the rumors, before anything ever reached the surface, there were meetings that never appeared on calendars and never produced witnesses. Meetings held away from public view, at private times, in rooms chosen specifically because nothing would escape them. According to what 50 Cent documents, these weren't accidental run-ins between powerful people. These were intentional moments, carefully selected locations, carefully selected timing, spaces where conversations could happen without interruption and without consequence. The same names keep circling these rooms: Diddy, Jay-Z, not in public settings, not where anyone could listen, behind closed doors. The documentary doesn't tell us exactly what was said. It doesn't speculate on words or decisions. Why, instead, it focuses on what mattered more than language: the structure, the fact that these conversations never left the room by design. Private rooms mean fewer witnesses. Private timing means fewer questions. And conversations that never leave the room mean no accountability. People who describe being around these meetings talk about the atmosphere more than the content. Calm, controlled, confident. The kind of environment where power doesn't need to announce itself because everyone already knows where it sits. And after these meetings came something else. Closed-door parties, not events meant to be seen, not industry celebrations meant for cameras, restricted gatherings where entry wasn't earned through fame, it was granted through familiarity. According to 50 Cent, these parties were intentionally undocumented. No guest lists, no photos, no timestamps. If you were there, you understood the rules without being told. If you weren't, you were never supposed to know they happened. Again, the same pattern appears, the same controlled environments, the same familiar faces. And once more, Diddy and Jay-Z surface quietly inside those spaces. Not photographed, not acknowledged, just present. These weren't wild, chaotic nights spiraling out of control. They were curated. Security filtered curiosity. Access filtered outsiders. Silence filtered everything else. Phones didn't need to be confiscated. They simply stayed away. Cameras didn't break. They just never came out. Because these events weren't designed to be remembered publicly. They were designed to leave nothing behind. Before going deeper into this video, make sure you like this video, subscribe our channel, and hit the bell icon. That's how you never miss any update. What makes this unsettling isn't what people claim happened inside these rooms. It's how carefully the outside world was excluded, how absence itself became protection. No posts the next morning, no casual mentions later, no stories passed around, just silence. And silence, repeated enough times, stops looking accidental. 50 Cent doesn't accuse Diddy or Jay-Z of actions in these spaces. He documents patterns. How often the same names appear in the same restricted environments. How familiarity replaces formality. How repetition replaces coincidence. Because when powerful figures keep showing up in places designed to stay undocumented, the question isn't what happened once. It's why these spaces existed at all. Closed-door parties don't just remove cameras. They remove witnesses. When they remove records, they remove consequences. And once you understand that these meetings and gatherings were built to leave no trace, something becomes clear. Whatever followed later, the alliances, the silence, the unanswered questions, it didn't begin in public. It began here, in private rooms, at private times, between people who understood exactly why nothing could ever leave the room. Because when conversations never escape and nights leave no records, power doesn't need to hide afterward. It's already protected the moment the door closes. As the night stretched past midnight, everything changed. These weren't events that happened while the world was still watching. They began after schedules ended, after attention faded, after visibility disappeared. Late night parties. For after-hours gatherings that existed outside normal observation, where time felt flexible and accountability felt distant. According to what 50 Cent documents, this timing was never accidental. The later it got, the fewer the eyes. The fewer the eyes, the safer the silence. And once again, the same names surfaced quietly in these spaces. Diddy, Jay-Z, not announced, not highlighted, just there. These gatherings weren't extensions of public events. They were separate worlds. Locations shifted late. Entrances changed. What started as something ordinary slowly transformed into something private. Phones didn't get taken away. They just stopped being used. Cameras didn't malfunction. They just disappeared. No one needed instructions. Everyone understood. People who describe these nights don't talk about chaos. They talk about atmosphere. About how conversations softened after a certain hour. How familiar faces stayed while others faded out. How the room felt different once it was clear the night belonged only to a few. And what remains from those nights isn't footage. It's memory. Moments that were never documented, never posted, never acknowledged. Moments involving Diddy and Jay-Z that existed only in people's recollection. That's where things become harder to explain later. Memory is fragile. It can be doubted, dismissed, reframed. And in environments designed to leave no record, memory is all that's left. It's also in these late-night spaces that the documentary begins touching on another layer, one kept even farther from public view. Secret romantic relationships, not rumors shouted into the open, not stories confirmed on record. A private involvement maintained carefully, far away from public image. According to the documentary, connections around Diddy and Jay-Z were managed with precision. No shared appearances, no overlap between private proximity and public narrative. Two lives running parallel without ever intersecting on camera. Publicly, there was distance. Privately, there was continuity. That separation didn't happen by accident. Relationships don't stay invisible without effort. They stay invisible when everyone involved understands that acknowledgement would change everything. These connections were never acknowledged openly, never denied either, just left untouched. People inside these circles understood the rules without needing them explained. Where meetings could happen, when visibility had to end, which spaces were considered safe. Silence wasn't requested, it was expected. The documentary doesn't label these relationships as right or wrong. It asks a different question. Why was public acknowledgement impossible? Why did protecting image require complete separation from private reality? Because when romantic involvement must exist entirely off record, it suggests exposure carried consequences far beyond embarrassment. Consequences to reputation, to influence, to carefully controlled narratives. Late nights made this possible. After hours, there were fewer boundaries, fewer questions, fewer people left to notice patterns forming, and patterns did form. The same private environments, the same timing, the same names, over years. By the time people realized how consistent these nights were, it felt too late to question them. Silence had already done its work. When what's unsettling isn't one memory, it's how many memories share the same shape. Because when moments are designed to exist only in memory, accountability fades with time. And when relationships are kept entirely outside public view, silence becomes the strongest form of protection. By the end of this section, one thing becomes clear. These late-night gatherings weren't about spontaneity or romance. They were about control. Control over timing, control over visibility, control over what could never be proven later. Because when nothing is recorded, everything can be denied. And when nights leave no trace, silence doesn't follow by accident. It follows by design. As the documentary moves forward, the atmosphere changes. This is where quiet observation turns into unease. The film raises concerns that were never spoken loudly at the time, only noticed, remembered, and later questioned. Alleged relationships involving young girls are not presented as facts, not as accusations, but as moments that made people uncomfortable without fully understanding why. The documentary is extremely careful here. It does not describe acts. It does not claim crimes. It does not draw conclusions. Instead, it focuses on presence, who was there, where they appeared, and why their presence raised silent alarms. Accounts describe young individuals showing up in environments that were clearly adult spaces, late-night settings, private gatherings, restricted rooms where influence and authority already dominated the atmosphere. Nothing was announced as wrong in the moment. Nothing was challenged openly, but people noticed. But age concerns were raised quietly, never in public, never on record, in side conversations, in exchanged looks, in warnings that were vague but intentional. Be careful, without explanation. When names like Diddy and Jay-Z were attached to those spaces, questioning felt dangerous. Not because anyone threatened anyone, but because power doesn't need to speak to be understood. Speaking meant risk. Silence felt safer. Some people describe confusion more than certainty. Others describe instantly sensing imbalance but choosing not to react. Careers mattered, access mattered, proximity to power mattered, and so discomfort was swallowed. What makes this unsettling isn't one moment. It's repetition. Different people, different years, different locations, the same uneasy feeling. The documentary doesn't ask viewers to decide what happened. It asks them to notice how often the same situation appeared and how often it went unaddressed. And then the film shifts again into another layer of secrecy. Alleged relationships with men, not framed as scandal, not framed as wrongdoing, but examined through the separation between private identity and public persona. The documentary makes one thing clear. This is not about judging identity. It's about concealment and the extreme effort placed on keeping certain parts of life completely invisible. Public image was tightly controlled, every appearance measured, every association filtered. Behind closed doors, those rules changed. According to accounts, private connections existed only in spaces where cameras never followed and questions were never asked. No confirmations, no denials, just silence maintained over time. What stands out is the discipline required. Different locations, different timing, different circles. Public life and private life were never allowed to overlap. That level of separation doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when exposure carries consequences. The documentary doesn't speculate on motives. It doesn't define anyone. It asks why secrecy had to be absolute, why even acknowledgement was treated as risk. Because when something must be hidden this carefully, the secrecy itself becomes revealing. People describe how trust worked in these environments. Who could be present? Who could be relied upon to stay quiet? Who understood the unspoken rules without them ever being explained? Breaking those rules didn't lead to confrontation. It led to disappearance. Invitations stopped coming. Access faded. Connections dissolved quietly. Not as punishment, but as prevention. By the end of this section, the weight doesn't come from accusation. It comes from structure, from how power, silence, and imbalance overlapped, from how discomfort was noticed but never addressed, from how identity, whatever it may have been, had to remain completely hidden to protect something larger. Because this isn't just about relationships. It's about a system where silence mattered more than clarity. And in that system, questions didn't disappear. They waited. As the documentary moves deeper, the focus shifts to a level of connection that carried real weight inside the industry. Secret relationships with celebrities, not casual friendships, not public collaborations, but powerful names moving together privately while maintaining visible distance in public. According to 50 Cent, the same pattern appeared again and again. Diddy, Jay-Z, and other influential figures rarely appeared closely connected in public. Different interviews, different narratives, different lanes that suggested separation. But behind closed doors, that separation didn't exist. Private gatherings, restricted rooms, after-hours environments, the same powerful names kept appearing together where no one was watching. Not photographed, not acknowledged, not explained. These weren't random run-ins. They weren't coincidences. The documentary shows how timelines quietly aligned. The same faces surfaced in the same private spaces across different years, different cities, different situations. Publicly, distance created safety. Privately, familiarity created trust. And that contrast mattered. Public distance reduced curiosity. Or private familiarity preserved access. No announcements were needed. No confirmations were required. Everyone inside these circles understood the arrangement. The film doesn't suggest conspiracy or secret planning sessions. It shows something subtler, mutual understanding, an understanding of when to appear apart publicly and when to move together in silence. Some accounts describe how certain celebrities always seemed informed before others, how reactions felt synchronized, how silence arrived at the same moment from different directions. Not because anyone ordered it, because alignment already existed. This is how influence protects itself. When powerful people share private spaces, silence becomes shared, not enforced, expected. No one benefits from breaking it. Reputation is at stake. Access is at stake. Entire careers are at stake. And then the documentary returns to something even heavier. Adult misconduct allegations, claims of inappropriate behavior that have circulated quietly for years. Disturbing stories said to have happened behind closed doors. The film is careful here. It doesn't sensationalize, it doesn't dramatize. It documents how these stories surfaced and why they never fully disappeared. What connects these accounts isn't detail, it's environment. Private spaces, limited witnesses, power imbalances that made speaking feel risky. Different people described similar unease, situations where boundaries were said to blur, moments that didn't feel right, but didn't feel safe enough to confront. At the time, many convinced themselves it was nothing. Later, distance changed perspective, and when multiple people reached similar realizations independently, the stories stopped feeling isolated. They started feeling patterned. The documentary doesn't accuse Diddy or Jay-Z directly. It asks why these stories were never addressed openly, why clarification never followed, why silence replaced explanation every time. Because silence doesn't erase allegations like these. It preserves them. It allows questions to grow heavier instead of fading. It allows patterns to emerge where individual moments once stood alone. The film shows how private celebrity spaces can normalize behavior that would never survive public scrutiny. How repetition can turn discomfort into routine. How routine slowly erodes the instinct to question. And that erosion is dangerous, not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it allows environments to exist without accountability. By the end of this section, the weight doesn't come from one story or one claim. It comes from accumulation, from how often similar unease is described, from how consistently the same private settings appear, from how reliably silence followed, because discomfort doesn't appear without reason. It grows where power goes unchecked, where visibility ends, where what happens behind closed doors is protected by design. And once those doors begin to open, even slightly, the focus shifts, not just to what may have happened, but to how long a system built around private familiarity and public distance was allowed to operate without ever being questioned. As the documentary moves forward, it stops focusing on events and starts focusing on people. Not the ones in headlines, the ones who were always there, unspoken connections. It's private inner circles that didn't need introductions, explanations, or acknowledgement. People who appeared again and again around Diddy and Jay-Z across different places in different years without ever being mentioned publicly. They weren't guests. They weren't staff. They were fixtures. The documentary shows how these individuals moved comfortably through the most restricted spaces. No hesitation, no permission needed. Their presence felt normal, expected, even though no one ever explained who they were or why they were there. That kind of access isn't accidental. Access like that is earned through trust, and trust like that isn't given lightly. Accounts describe how the energy in a room shifted when these figures arrived. Conversations changed, behavior adjusted. Fortunately, people instinctively understood where they stood without a single word being spoken. Authority didn't need to announce itself. It was felt. What's unsettling is how invisible these connections were to the public story. No interviews, no mentions, no acknowledgement that these people existed at all. And yet, inside private environments tied to Diddy and Jay-Z, their presence was constant. That absence from the public narrative wasn't oversight. It was protection. The documentary suggests that these inner circles carried continuity. They remembered what others forgot. They understood how things worked when no one else was watching. They maintained silence not because they were told to, but because silence was the price of belonging. And then the film turns to another layer of the same structure, off-record relationships. Privately maintained ties that were never confirmed and never denied. These weren't rumors, desperate for attention. They were relationships that existed quietly, deliberately kept outside the reach of documentation. No statements, no denials, no explanations. Just distance in public and familiarity in private. People describe how these associations were treated as understood truths within the circle. No one asked questions because questions weren't welcome. No one demanded clarity because clarity would have created records. And records were the one thing these relationships could not survive. What stands out is how long these ties lasted. Public images changed. Narratives shifted. Controversies came and went. The private relationships remained intact. Not visible, but consistent. That consistency doesn't happen by chance. Maintaining off-record relationships requires discipline. It requires coordination. It requires a shared understanding that silence benefits everyone involved. Silence preserved access. Silence preserved influence. Silence preserved the system. The documentary doesn't claim these relationships were wrong by default. It asks why they needed to exist this way at all, why acknowledgement was impossible, why denial was unnecessary, why silence was always chosen. Because when associations live entirely off the record, they don't just avoid scrutiny, they reshape reality. Public narratives stay clean. Private behavior continues uninterrupted. And over time, that split becomes normal. By the end of this section, one realization settles quietly. The most powerful connections around Diddy and Jay-Z weren't the ones people could see. They were the ones no one could name, the ones that never appeared on paper, the ones that existed only in proximity, access, and silence. And when relationships can survive for years without ever being confirmed or denied, they aren't hiding. They're functioning exactly as intended, protected not by lies, but by the understanding that some things are never meant to be said out loud. As the documentary continues, the focus widens beyond individuals and lands on something far more protected. Hidden alliances within the industry. Not partnerships announced on stage, not friendships discussed in interviews, but coordination that only made sense behind the scenes. Publicly, there was separation, different lanes, different statements, different narratives suggesting independence between Diddy and Jay-Z. Privately, alignment kept appearing. According to what 50 Cent lays out, moments of public distance often match moments of private unity. Silence arrived at the same time. Attention shifted in the same direction. Decisions unfolded quietly without explanation. No meetings announced, no agreements recorded, just understanding. An understanding of when to appear apart publicly and when to move together where no one was watching. This is how protection works when visibility becomes a risk. Behavior replaces paperwork. Timing replaces statements. Silence replaces denial. The documentary shows how industry reactions often felt synchronized. Questions went unanswered at the same moment. Curiosity was redirected without being acknowledged. The same topics were avoided across different platforms, as if by instinct. Not because someone gave instructions, but because alignment already existed. Public separation wasn't accidental. It was functional. It reduced scrutiny. It scattered responsibility. It made accountability harder to locate. And inside that structure, another reality never went away. Unverified accusations, claims that didn't explode into courtrooms, claims that didn't arrive with documents or verdicts, but claims that never disappeared. After 50 Cent's earlier documentary, many expected closure, clear denials, direct explanations, something that addressed the patterns head-on. What followed instead was silence. No detailed responses, no dismantling of the questions, no effort to explain why the same concerns kept surfacing. And silence doesn't erase accusations like these. It preserves them. The documentary traces how these claims resurfaced quietly over time. In private warnings, in careful conversations, in things people said without ever putting them on record. Different voices, different years, the same unease. Not identical stories, but familiar shapes. Private settings, limited witnesses, power imbalances, and afterward, nothing. False stories usually collapse. They lose momentum. They fade when attention moves on. These didn't. They lingered. And lingering questions behave differently. They don't demand belief. They demand attention. The film shows how unanswered accusations slowly accumulate weight. Viewers begin connecting timelines, comparing environments, noticing how often the same names appear around the same silences. That lack of resolution becomes its own signal, because resolution doesn't require admission, it requires engagement. Here, engagement never came. Instead, one public separation continued. Private alignment remained intact, and that combination is powerful. It allows influence to operate without exposure. It allows protection without confirmation. It allows questions to exist without answers. By the end of this section, the realization is hard to ignore. When alliances are hidden, accountability scatters. When accusations are left unanswered, they don't disappear. They settle. And once they've settled long enough, the story changes. It stops being about whether something can be proven. It becomes about why, after years and after 50 Cent's earlier documentary, the same questions were still left untouched. Because silence can protect power for a long time. But it also keeps every unanswered question alive, quietly waiting for the moment when patterns become impossible to ignore. As the documentary moves closer to its core, it begins examining relationships that existed in a deliberate in-between space, unconfirmed associations, connections that were never acknowledged publicly, never explained, never denied. On paper, these bonds didn't exist. In interviews and public narratives, there was nothing to point to. But privately, they were preserved. The same proximity kept returning. The same access was granted. The same familiarity appeared again and again around Diddy and Jay-Z, even when public stories suggested distance. What makes this unsettling isn't secrecy alone. It's effort. Erasing a relationship publicly takes intention. Maintaining it privately takes discipline. Both sides have to understand the same rule. Silence is safer than truth. The documentary shows how public separation became routine. Appearing unconnected reduced scrutiny. It allowed curiosity to fade. Meanwhile, private access continued without interruption. Meetings still happened. Restricted spaces still open. Familiar faces still moved freely. Accounts describe how these bonds were treated as understood facts inside inner circles. No one asked questions because questions weren't welcome. No one demanded clarity because clarity would have created records. And records were the one thing these relationships could not survive. That ambiguity became protection. If something isn't acknowledged, it can't be confronted. If it isn't confirmed, it can't be disproven. If it doesn't officially exist, responsibility becomes impossible to assign. The documentary suggests these associations weren't hidden because they were fragile. They were hidden because they were valuable. Valuable enough to preserve privately. Valuable enough to erase publicly. And inside those same private environments, another reality becomes impossible to ignore. Power dynamics. These spaces were never equal. Influence controlled access long before anyone arrived. Who entered the room, who stayed late, who felt comfortable speaking, none of it was random. People adjusted instinctively. Conversations softened. Behavior shifted. No one announced authority. Everyone felt it. This is where significant age gap concerns begin to surface. Not as accusations, but as alarms that quietly rang and were never answered. Accounts describe younger individuals present in environments dominated by experience, status, and control. Late nights, restricted gatherings, spaces where power already leaned heavily in one direction. And nothing was officially questioned. Nothing was openly challenged. But discomfort existed. People noticed the imbalance. They sensed it in the atmosphere. They felt it in the way conversations unfolded. The documentary doesn't claim intent. It doesn't describe acts. It examines structure. When age gaps exist alongside unchecked influence, vulnerability doesn't need to be created. It already exists. Younger individuals didn't control the space. They didn't set the rules. They didn't decide when things started or ended. Power did, and power shaped what felt possible to say and what felt impossible to challenge. Concerns surfaced quietly, in side comments, in vague warnings, in advice like, "Be careful," without explanation. That caution wasn't ignorance. It was fear of consequence. Because questioning power inside private spaces often meant risking access, careers, protection, and momentum. So most people chose silence, not because they agreed with what they were seeing, but because silence felt safer than disruption. Over time, that silence normalized imbalance. What once felt uncomfortable became routine. What once raised alarms faded into background noise. And routine is dangerous, because when imbalance becomes normal, accountability disappears. By the end of this section, the weight isn't created by proof. It's created by repetition, the same structures, the same access, the same hesitation to speak, again and again. And when private spaces are built around unchecked influence, the question stops being what happened. It becomes how much could happen without anyone ever feeling able to stop it. Because power doesn't need permission to operate. It only needs silence. And in these spaces, silence was always present, quiet, consistent, and protective. As the documentary reaches its final stretch, everything that once felt scattered begins to connect. Not into accusations, not into verdicts, but into pressure. For years, exploitation rumors moved quietly through the industry, never loud enough to force action, never clear enough to demand accountability. Just whispers that followed certain rooms, certain nights, certain names. They weren't shared publicly, they were passed carefully. Concerns around vulnerable individuals surfaced the same way, in pauses, in coded language, in warnings that came without detail, because detail felt dangerous. And those whispers didn't appear randomly. They followed patterns. The same types of private environments, the same restricted access, the same power structures repeating year after year, different eras, different cities, the same unease. People would speak in private only to realize someone else had noticed the same thing long before. Not the same story, but the same discomfort, the same feeling that something about these spaces wasn't right. That's when coincidence starts to lose credibility, because rumors don't survive for years without reinforcement. They survive because silence protects them. The documentary shows how this system functioned without needing threats or orders. No one had to be told to stay quiet. The cost of speaking was already understood. Access could disappear. Opportunities could dry up. Careers could stall without explanation. So people stayed silent. Not because they believed nothing was wrong, but because silence felt like survival. This is how systems protect themselves, not through denial, through exhaustion. People grow tired of carrying questions alone. They convince themselves discomfort isn't enough to risk everything. They learn to look away from what can't be changed until something shifts. What changed this time was visibility. With this new documentary, the whispers are no longer isolated. They're placed side by side. Patterns that once felt personal now look structural. The same environments around Diddy and Jay-Z are no longer invisible. The film doesn't accuse, it doesn't conclude, it connects. And connection is dangerous for any system built on silence. Because silence only works when people believe they're alone. Once they realize they're not, the structure weakens. And the documentary shows how repetition creates pressure, how awareness spreads quietly, how people begin to recognize that what they noticed years ago wasn't isolated. It was shared. That shared recognition changes everything. The system hasn't collapsed, but it's no longer hidden. And once something built on silence becomes visible, it doesn't need to be attacked. It begins to strain under its own weight. Not all at once, not dramatically, but inevitably, because silence can protect power for a long time, just not forever. And now, after 50 Cent's new documentary lays these patterns out clearly, the pressure isn't coming from accusations. It's coming from awareness, from the realization that the same concerns echoed for years, that the same structures repeated without interruption, that the same questions were never answered. Well, true, this isn't the end of the story, but it is the moment the system stopped being invisible. And once enough people see the same pattern at the same time, the question stops being whether something will change. It becomes how long silence can hold, now that everyone is finally looking.